Jake Turner pulled his threadbare coat tighter around his shoulders, his weathered hands seeking whatever warmth they could find in the worn fabric. At 53, his face bore the deep lines of a man who had seen more than his share of hardship, yet his eyes retained a spark of dignity that life on the streets had failed to extinguish. The evening crowd had thinned, leaving behind only the occasional click of heels against pavement and the distant wail of sirens. Jake had learned to find comfort in these quieter moments. When the city's judgment seemed to soften, he made his way down Morrison Street, scanning the ground out of habit. Years of homelessness had taught him that survival often meant finding value in what others overlooked. The streetlight above flickered, casting an uneven glow on something that caught Jake's eye. There, wedged against a building's corner, lay a leather wallet. It was expensive, the kind Jake remembered from his previous life, before the recession had claimed his job, his home, and eventually his family. He approached it cautiously, looking around to see if anyone had dropped it recently. The wallet was heavy in his hands, its leather smooth and warm, as if it still held the heat of its owner's pocket. Jake's fingers trembled as he opened it, not from the cold, but from the weight of what he found inside. Several $100 bills, multiple credit cards, and a driver's license bearing the name Ethan Miles. Jake's breath caught in his throat. Everyone in the city knew that name. Ethan Miles, the tech mogul whose company had transformed the skyline with gleaming towers of glass and steel. The same Ethan Miles whose face appeared on business magazines and local news, whose philanthropic foundation funded half the shelters in the city. For a moment, Jake allowed himself to imagine what he could do with the money. A warm hotel room, real food, maybe even a decent set of clothes for job interviews. The thought burned in his mind like a fever dream, but something deeper stirred within him. A memory of his father's voice. A man's character is what he does when no one is watching. The corporate headquarters of Miles Technologies wasn't far. Jake had passed it countless times, though he'd never dared to approach the imposing structure. Now, as he stood before its entrance, the glass doors reflected his image, a stark contrast to the polished interior beyond. The security guard at the desk eyed him suspiciously, hand hovering near his radio. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step back." Jake raised his hand slowly, the wallet visible in his right. "Please, I found Mr. Miles's wallet. I just want to return it." The guard's expression shifted from suspicion to disbelief as he examined the wallet's contents. A series of quick phone calls followed, and before Jake could fully process what was happening, he found himself being escorted to a private elevator. The ascent to the top floor was smooth and swift, but to Jake, it felt like crossing an invisible boundary between worlds. The elevator opened directly into a penthouse office where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city he knew so intimately from below. Ethan Miles stood from behind his desk, younger in person than he appeared in photos, with kind eyes that seemed to carry their own light. He crossed the room with an extended hand. "Mr. Turner, I understand I have you to thank for returning my wallet." Jake shook his hand, feeling self-conscious about his rough palms. "Anyone would have done the same, sir." "We both know that's not true." Ethan's smile was genuine as he reached for his wallet. "Please, let me reward your honesty." He began counting out several bills. Jake accepted the reward with quiet gratitude, though the amount made him uncomfortable. It was more money than he'd held in years, yet somehow less satisfying than the simple act of doing what was right. "Would you join me for lunch?" Ethan gestured to a small conference table where lunch for two was already being set up. "I'd love to hear your story." The aroma of fresh food made Jake's stomach clench, but he thought of old Maria, who always saved him a spot in the shelter line. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Miles, but I need to help a friend. She's counting on me." Something flickered across Ethan's face, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. He nodded slowly, respect evident in his expression. "Of course. Thank you again, Mr. Turner. Your integrity is remarkable." As Jake rode the elevator back down, the small stack of bills in his pocket felt like both a blessing and a burden. He thought about old Maria, about the others who shared his corner of the city. The money would help, but it was the warmth in his chest, the knowledge that he'd done the right thing, that truly sustained him as he stepped back into the cold. The city seemed different somehow as he made his way back to his usual spots. The The same streets, the same buildings, but something had shifted, like the first hint of spring after a long winter. Jake didn't know it yet, but his simple act of honesty had set in motion events that would change not only his life but the lives of countless others. As night fell over the city, he pulled his coat closer, unaware that somewhere above, in a penthouse office, Ethan Miles sat lost in thought, turning over a worn leather wallet and contemplating the true meaning of wealth. In his penthouse office, Ethan Miles remained motionless before the sprawling cityscape, the leather wallet still warm in his hands. The lights of countless windows twinkled below like earthbound stars, each one representing a story he had never bothered to consider before. The encounter with Jake Turner had cracked something in his carefully constructed worldview, letting in questions he couldn't easily dismiss. Sarah, his executive assistant for the past decade, watched him with barely concealed concern. She had never seen him like this, lost in thought for hours after a simple wallet return. "Should I reschedule your evening meetings, sir?" Ethan turned, his usually sharp features softened by contemplation. "Cancel them, all of them, and get me everything you can find about homelessness in our city. Statistics, causes, current initiatives, everything." The next several hours became a deep dive into a world Ethan had previously acknowledged only through tax-deductible donations and annual charity galas. The numbers were staggering, thousands living on the streets, many of them former professionals like Jake, victims of circumstances rather than choices. Each statistic now had a face, the dignified man who had stood in his office, choosing integrity over necessity. As midnight approached, Ethan found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. He walked. Leaving the security of his building behind, he traversed the same streets Jake had walked hours earlier. The city was different at night, rawer somehow, more honest about its contradictions. Every doorway held a story, every shadowed alley concealed a life he had never thought to understand. He passed a woman huddled in a blanket, her age impossible to determine beneath layers of hardship. She was reading a worn paperback by the light of a street lamp. The sight stopped him cold. This simple act of seeking knowledge or escape despite circumstances struck him as profoundly human. "Excuse me," he said, approaching carefully. "I'm looking for someone who might know Jake Turner." The woman looked up, her eyes sharp and evaluating. "Who's asking?" "My name is Ethan. He helped me today. I'd like to return the favor." She marked her page carefully before closing the book. "Jake? Yeah, I know Jake. Everyone around here does. He's good people." She introduced herself as Maria, and Ethan recognized the name Jake had mentioned earlier. "Sit down, rich man. Let me tell you about Jake Turner." For the next 2 hours, Ethan sat on cold concrete, listening to stories that transformed Jake from a single act of honesty into a full, complex human being. He learned about Jake's past as a construction project manager, about the family he had lost to divorce during the financial crisis, about his unfailing kindness even in the depths of his own struggles. "You know what he did last week?" Maria's voice carried a mixture of pride and exasperation. "Found a kid, couldn't have been more than 16, trying to sleep in the park. Instead of taking the spot in the shelter he'd waited all day for, he gave it to that boy. Spent the night out here with me instead." Each story added layers to the man Ethan had met, painting a picture of someone who had retained his humanity despite every reason to lose it. "Why doesn't he ask for help?" Ethan wondered aloud. Maria's laugh was soft but pointed. "Ask who? The system that failed him? The society that looks through him? Jake helps himself by helping others. That's his way." Dawn was breaking by the time Ethan returned to his penthouse. His expensive suit was dirty from sitting on the ground, but he felt cleaner somehow, as if a film had been wiped from his eyes. He stood in his marble shower, letting hot water wash over him, thinking about Jake sleeping rough in the cold. The decision crystallized slowly but inevitably, like a snowflake forming in winter air. Ethan had built his fortune by identifying problems and creating solutions, by seeing opportunities others missed. But he had never faced a challenge quite like this: how to help someone who asked for nothing, whose dignity was as much a part of him as his need. He called Sarah as soon as the hour was decent. "I need you to set something up, but it has to be perfect. No charity, no publicity, nothing that would feel like pity. The plan took shape over the next few days. Ethan's team worked quietly, gathering information, making arrangements. He learned that Jake had been a skilled project manager before the recession, that his work had been respected, his references still glowing years later. More importantly, they found patterns in Maria's stories, Jake's natural ability to organize resources, to coordinate between different homeless groups, to maximize the limited help available. In his private moments, Ethan found himself returning to the wallet, now sitting on his desk like a talisman. He thought about what real wealth meant, about the arbitrary nature of fortune and misfortune. His own success had been built on talent and hard work, yes, but also on opportunities and second chances that Jake had never received. The more he learned about Jake's world, the more Ethan recognized something he had lost somewhere between his first million and his first billion. The understanding that business could be about more than profit, that true innovation meant seeing the human element in every equation. He began redesigning entire sections of his company's charitable foundation, moving away from the traditional model of annual donations towards sustainable programs that could create lasting change. But that was for later. First, he had to find a way to help one man who had reminded him of what integrity really meant. The solution, when it finally came to him, was elegant in its simplicity. Jake didn't need charity. He needed what everyone needs: purpose, dignity, and a chance to rebuild. Ethan had the power to offer all three, but only if he could do it in a way that respected who Jake was, not just what he needed. As his team finalized the details, Ethan found himself feeling nervous, something he hadn't experienced since his first startup pitch. This mattered more somehow, carried more weight than any business deal. He was learning that it's one thing to write checks to charity, and quite another to look directly into the face of need and find a way to help that doesn't diminish the human spirit. In the end, he wrote the invitation himself, then rewrote it a dozen times until the words felt right. As he watched his assistant depart to deliver it, Ethan realized that regardless of how Jake responded, something fundamental had already changed. The city below his window was no longer just a marketplace or a skyline. It was a community of stories, of lives interconnected in ways he was only beginning to understand. The sun set over the city, painting the sky in shades of promise. Somewhere out there, Jake Turner was about to receive an invitation that could change his life. But Ethan understood now that the greater change had already occurred, not in any material circumstance, but in the way two men from different worlds had caused each other to see life anew. As the last rays of sunlight painted the city in amber hues, Jake was finishing his usual evening routine, checking on the elderly residents who lived in makeshift shelters under the Harrison Street Bridge, sharing what little he had from the day's panhandling. The familiar rhythm of these moments was interrupted by the appearance of a man in a tailored suit, so out of place in this forgotten corner of the city that several heads turned to watch his approach. "Mr. Turner?" The man's voice was respectful, almost deferential. "I'm David Shunn, Mr. Miles's personal assistant. He asked me to deliver this to you." He held out a cream-colored envelope, the paper thick and expensive beneath Jake's weathered fingers. Jake stared at the envelope, its weight somehow more significant than its physical presence warranted. The other residents gathered closer, curious about this unusual interruption to their evening routine. Old Maria shuffled forward, her arthritic hands clutching her worn shawl, her eyes sharp with interest. "Well, go on then," she urged, nudging Jake's elbow. "Open it before we all die of curiosity." With careful movements, Jake broke the seal and extracted a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was precise but personal, not typed or printed. "Dear Mr. Turner, your act of integrity has stayed with me these past days, prompting much reflection on the nature of wealth and worth. I would be honored if you would join me for a conversation about possibility. Yours, mine, and perhaps our cities. A car will be waiting at the corner of Harrison and 12th tomorrow at 10 a.m. If you choose to accept this invitation, please know that this is not charity, but rather an opportunity for mutual benefit. With respect, Ethan Miles." Jake read the words twice more, then passed the letter to Maria, who held it close to her face in the fading light. The assistant waited patiently, his presence a bridge between two worlds that rarely intersected so directly. "Mr. Miles understands if you need time to consider," David offered quietly, But he asked me to assure you that this invitation comes with no obligations, only possibilities. Jake looked around at the familiar faces of his street family, each wearing expressions that ranged from excitement to concern. These people had become his community, his support system in a world that had stripped away everything else. The thought of stepping away, even briefly, into that other world of glass and steel felt like a kind of betrayal. "You go," Maria said firmly, reading his hesitation, "and don't you dare feel guilty about it. We all need a door to open sometimes. The shame is in refusing to walk through it when it does." The night passed slowly, filled with conversations that stretched into the early hours. The community under the bridge had become an impromptu council, sharing stories of opportunities missed and seized, of risks taken and regretted. Some spoke of pride that had kept them from accepting help when it was offered, others of trust betrayed when they had reached for assistance. Dawn found Jake still awake, watching the city slowly come to life. The morning light revealed the stark contrast between the gleaming downtown towers and the shadowed underpasses where he had made his home. He thought about the many mornings he had watched suited figures hurry past, their eyes carefully averted, their paths curving away from his presence. At 9:30, Jake did something he hadn't done in years. He tried to make himself presentable. Maria produced a small bar of soap she'd been saving, and another resident offered a relatively clean shirt. They worked together, this makeshift family, to prepare him for a journey into a world that had once been his own. The black car appeared precisely at 10, its polished surface reflecting the morning sun like a mirror. The driver, a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, opened the door without a hint of judgment. "Good morning, Mr. Turner. I'm Sarah. Mr. Miles is looking forward to meeting with you." The drive was surreal, each block marking a transition from one reality to another. Jake watched his familiar streets transform into the manicured boulevards of the business district. The car's interior was climate-controlled, the leather seats soft and comfortable, yet Jake had never felt more aware of his circumstances, of the vast gap between where he slept and where he was heading. Miles Technologies occupied the top floors of a building that seemed to touch the clouds. The elevator ride was smooth and swift, but Jake's stomach churned with more than just the rapid ascent. Each floor that passed represented another layer of separation from his life below, another step into a world he had thought forever closed to him. The elevator opened directly into a space that defied his expectations. Instead of the cold, corporate environment he remembered from his previous visit, he found himself in what appeared to be a comfortable living room. Warm woods and soft fabrics replaced the expected glass and chrome. Ethan Miles stood by a window, dressed not in a suit, but in casual clothes that somehow made him seem more approachable. "Jake," Ethan greeted him with a genuine smile, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming. Please, make yourself comfortable." The next hours unfolded in a way Jake could never have anticipated. They talked not as benefactor and supplicant, but as two men who had each seen different sides of life's complexity. Ethan shared stories of his own struggles, of failures and doubts that never made it into the press releases. Jake found himself opening up about his past, about the cascade of events that had led him to the streets, and about the unexpected community he had found there. "I've spent the past few days learning about you," Ethan admitted as their conversation deepened, "about how you organize resources among the homeless community, how you help newcomers navigate the system, how you create structure in a world that tries to deny it to you." Jake shifted uncomfortably, and used to having his daily acts of survival examined in this way. "We help each other. That's all." "That's everything," Ethan corrected gently, "and that's why I asked you here today. I have a proposition for you, not charity, but a partnership." What followed was a proposal that took Jake's breath away. Ethan outlined a plan that would utilize Jake's experience and skills in a way he had never imagined possible. A new division within Miles Technologies' charitable foundation, focused on creating practical, sustainable solutions for homelessness, with Jake as its director. "You understand both worlds now," Ethan explained, his enthusiasm evident. "You have the professional background in project management, but more importantly, you have first-hand knowledge of what really works and what doesn't. I can provide the resources, but I need someone who knows how to use them effectively." The position came with everything Jake had lost: an apartment, a salary, healthcare, but it was the purpose behind it that made his hands tremble, that caused his vision to blur with unexpected tears. This wasn't just a job offer. It was an opportunity to bridge the gap between two worlds he knew intimately, to create real change from a place of understanding. Why me? Jake finally managed to ask, his voice rough with emotion. Ethan was quiet for a moment, looking out at the city below. Because when you found my wallet, you didn't just return my money. You reminded me of something I'd forgotten. Success isn't just about what we achieve for ourselves. It's about what we make possible for others. As the sun reached its zenith outside the windows, Jake Turner sat in a room high above the streets he called home, holding in his hands not just an opportunity for himself, but a chance to transform the lives of others who were still waiting for their own doors to open. In that moment, the distance between the penthouse and the underpass seemed both vast and insignificant, a gap that could be bridged by understanding, compassion, and the simple recognition of human dignity. The city stretched out below them, a landscape of possibility waiting to be reshaped by their unlikely partnership. This was no fairy tale ending, but rather the beginning of something far more meaningful, a chance to prove that sometimes the greatest wealth lies not in what we keep, but in what we're willing to share. The weeks that followed transformed both the city and its inhabitants in ways no one could have predicted. Jake's transition from the streets to his new apartment was a journey filled with profound moments of adjustment. The first night, he sat on the floor of his furnished one-bedroom home, overwhelmed by the silence, the softness of the carpet beneath his fingers, and the gentle hum of the heating system. The bed felt too comfortable after years of concrete, so he slept on the floor for the first week, gradually allowing himself to accept this new reality. Each morning, he would wake before dawn. Old habits died hard, and stand at his window, watching his former world come to life below. He knew every rhythm of the streets, every corner where someone might be seeking shelter, every early opening cafe that might offer warmth to those who had nowhere else to go. But now, he watched with new purpose, understanding that his knowledge could bridge worlds that had seemed forever separated. The Miles Foundation's new homeless outreach and rehabilitation division took shape under Jake's guidance. He insisted on hiring people who had experienced homelessness themselves, creating a team that understood the complexities of life on the streets. Their first initiative was simple but revolutionary. They created a network of 24-hour resource centers, not just shelters, but places where people could receive mail, take showers, access computers, and most importantly, find respect and dignity. Old Maria became one of their